Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You will hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Well, welcome back to the Rural Scoop. Today, we're diving into a topic that has major implications for rural students and their post-secondary opportunities. I'm thrilled to welcome back Dr. Mara Tieken, who has been on the podcast before discussing her work on rural school closures. And if you haven't checked out that episode, I highly recommend it. So make sure that you go back and catch that. Joining us for the first time today are two more incredible guests, Alyssa Ratledge and Sabrina Klein. And together, all three of them are part of a new, exciting initiative, the IES Research and Development Center in Rural Higher Education. This federal investment is a big deal, and we're going to break down what it means for rural students, colleges, and communities. So, Mara, Alyssa, and Sabrina, welcome to the Rural Scoop. It's great to have you all here.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get started with the nitty-gritty of the questions that we're going to walk through together, I'm going to have each of you just do a real brief introduction of who you are and where you're coming from so that our listeners get a chance to know a little bit more about you. And we're going to go in alphabetical order. So Alyssa, let's have you introduce yourself first.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Alyssa Ratledge. I am a research associate at MDRC, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. And my focus area is on rural higher education or post-secondary access and success. So I really focus on how we can help our rural students and our rural colleges be successful. And just because I know you have an Arizona audience, Melissa, I'll also say that I am a proud graduate of Mesa Public Schools in Arizona.
Fantastic. I did not know that. That's wonderful. Mara.
So hi, everybody. My name is Mara Tieken. I'm an associate professor of education at Bates College. My research focuses on rural education, and I do a lot of work on school closures, as Melissa indicated. And I also do a lot of work on rural access to higher education. And I actually have a book coming out in May called Educated Out: How Rural Students Navigate Elite Colleges and What It Costs Them. And before I began teaching here at Bates College, I'm a third grade teacher in rural Tennessee.
And Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Klein. I'm a research associate at MDRC in our K-12 policy area where I work with Alyssa. And my work focuses on rural college access and success, particularly how we can strengthen the connections between K-12, higher education, and workforce. And my research focuses on qualitatively how we can learn more about those topics. And before coming to MDRC, I spent the majority of my life in a rural community. I grew up in southwestern Oregon, and I came from a town of 500 people. So this work is very real to me personally and professionally. I spent 15 years as a college access practitioner working in TRIO and Gear Up programs. And so I'm really delighted to be in the conversation with you all today because this topic is very important to me personally.
Awesome. I'm going to be very excited to hear about your rural upbringing because 500 people in a town is pretty rural. So let's go ahead and get started with the big picture. So the IES Research and Development Center represents a significant investment in rural education. So why is this such an exciting moment and why does it matter for rural communities?
We are really excited about the Rural Research and Development Center in higher ed because this is the first time that one of these research and development centers is focused on high school to college transition, college completion, and workforce development. And these are all really big, important topics for the folks that we work with in our rural schools and our rural colleges. Most of my career has been focused on rural community colleges. And as you might imagine, we actually know very little about what works best in rural community colleges, both to help students be successful and get the degrees that they're seeking, but also how those colleges can operate most effectively using the resources that they have. So we're really excited that we'll be able to learn a lot about what works for them in the uniquely rural environment. We're further focusing on two regions of the country, the Mountain West and the Deep South. And I think that's going to help us learn a lot about what the unique workforce development opportunities are there, what those unique demographics of students are looking for in a college experience, and how we can support the economic vibrancy of the small towns in those parts of the country. So I'm really excited we're going to generate so much that is uniquely rural, not the typical, let's learn something nationally and then apply it. Maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't, to a rural context.
So, Sabrina, how do you plan to engage rural communities and institutions in your research so that it really reflects their needs?
This is something that I think Alyssa and I were the most proud of in our proposal to do this work. So we have two advisory committees that are both guiding the center and offering support to each of the individual study teams. So we have a research advisory group composed of folks who do phenomenal work in this space or related to this space, who will help to guide us both from an education standpoint, but we also have folks who work in sociology or also run similar type of centers. And so we're excited to have their input and guidance and feedback moving forward in the next 5 years. And we've already begun engaging those folks. We also have a phenomenal group of practitioners who compose our other advisory committee. And we're hoping, and I have to give Alyssa credit for this saying, those folks will keep us honest in this work and will not only give us feedback and offer insights for our studies, but we're also providing a space. We want to continue learning from those folks about what's happening on the ground for them during the life of this center so that we can think about ways that the research might better support the work that they're doing or be able to connect those folks with resources within the center. We also have an amazing team of dissemination partners, so folks who are already doing this work, such as the Rural Educators. We're big fans of the Rural Educator. We're working with different organizations across the country, either to partner with their pre-existing channels or ways that they connect with their practitioners or policymakers or stakeholders. And then within each of the studies, depending on the study and what makes sense for that study, folks, for example, Mara and I will be holding some stakeholder convenings where we plan to invite folks who matter most to the work to come and learn about what we're doing, learn about what we're finding, share how this fits or doesn't fit into the work that they do, and continue to build that community and increase the connection between practitioners and research. My experience as a practitioner, I often felt so disconnected from that world, from policymaking, from research. And it's one of my personal drives is to make practitioners, bring them closer to the work. They're so integral and important to the work. And education research is practice, and we need those folks at the table with us.
Well said. I understand that disconnect that can sometimes be a barrier for ensuring that there's that synergy across both fields. Yeah. So what methodologies is the center going to use to ensure that the data that you're collecting is meaningful to practitioners, speaking of the practitioner component of this whole equation?
Yeah. So we have a variety of studies that are looking at different questions using different methods. So some of our studies are going to be big quantitative studies using state agency data. Can we analyze what the outcomes are for the expansion of dual enrollment to rural students? And that's going to give us in the states we're working with some really clear guidance about what that expansion has meant for students in dual enrollment and their longer-term higher ed trajectories. Then some of our studies are answering questions that are much earlier on. For instance, how do students make decisions about what kind of institution to attend if they are coming out of a rural area that doesn't have a local college institution? Mm-hmm. So for there, we're really focused on that qualitative piece. What are students' experiences? What's the decision-making process that they undertake to understand where they're going to go long term? One of the big things I'm really happy about in the center is that all of our studies are going to have reports that are meant for practitioners and policymakers. So we don't see this as we will conduct a traditional study and the findings will live in a paywalled journal.
Mhm.
Many of us will also write paywall journal articles. However, we're also going to write pieces that are short, 2 or 3 pages, clear takeaways. What is something that a teacher, a guidance counselor, an admissions counselor at a college could learn from this to really understand how better to serve their rural students?
I love that. That's fantastic. So, one of the ongoing challenges in rural education is how often rural communities are misunderstood, especially when it comes to higher education. So, what do people tend to get wrong about rural college access and success?
I can start us out because I think there's a number of things that that are often misunderstood about rural education, rural communities. I think one of the biggest ones is that rural communities just don't value education. And that's what explains the lower college going rates and college graduation rates. But we actually know that that's not true. I mean, the first thing, as Alyssa mentioned, there's higher high school graduation rates in rural than non-rural areas. And we know that many rural families actually really want to pursue, for their children to pursue a college degree. And just for whatever reason, they're not able to. And then I think also we really need to look at the economic picture here. So traditionally, many rural communities um, were the backbone of those communities is an industry that does not require a college degree. And so college going specifically in terms of like getting a degree, particularly a 4-year degree, it just didn't make sense in the context of a rural economy. And so students and families were actually making quite calculated decisions around college going because it wasn't applicable. It also often cost them a lot of money, and we know that rural students take on a disproportionate amount of debt. And so there are all kinds of barriers that I think are not about rural culture or rural values around education, but are much more baked into um, unequal access to many educational opportunities and also just the structure of rural economies. So I think a lot of the discussion around rural culture and sort of undervaluing education is just completely misguided. And we really need to be looking at, those structural aspects, the economic aspects that are producing the kinds of inequalities we see in terms of college access and college attainment.
So, to that point, obviously people might have an assumption that there are the same college going pathways, whether you're in urban, suburban, or rural. So, how are the experiences of rural students different when it relates to that pathway that they might be able to travel to get to higher ed?
Well, actually, the way you phrased the question, first, the distance, right? Actually, to get to an institution of higher education is much greater for many rural areas. So many rural communities are education deserts. They don't have the kind of opportunities. They don't have institutions of higher education close by. So actually being able to be proximate to an institution, and we know just that mere proximity actually increases the chances that a student will apply to college and go to college. And then there's also a lot of barriers in terms of, unequal access to AP classes, for example. So advanced placement classes, which produce the kind of college preparation that is useful in terms of being prepared, but also that colleges look for in terms of admitting students. We know that many rural schools don't have guidance counselors. Or their guidance counselors are completely overburdened in terms of the number of students they have, so they can't provide adequate counseling for students. Um, so in terms of that kind of traditional path to college, for many rural students, it's just not available, or just the kinds of stepping stones you might encounter along the way that would put you on the path towards college just aren't there. And so, when we talk about kind of the choice to go to college, the decision to go to college, for many rural students, it's not a choice just because they actually didn't have options. So that I think is a big prohibitive factor, particularly in terms of that, like, go to high school, then, apply and go on to a 4-year degree. There's just many more barriers in place when it comes for rural students. That said, and maybe Sabrina or Alyssa can talk a little bit about this. I think this is where rural community colleges are particularly important in terms of getting many rural students on the path to an associate's degree, and then perhaps being able to pursue a bachelor's degree down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the incredible strengths of a rural community college is its knowledge of what the labor market looks like and what the community needs are in its community. And I want to emphasize that this can sometimes be a community or a catchment area for hundreds of miles in every direction, right? Many of our rural 2-year colleges are serving a 500 or 600 mile radius, especially in the Mountain West, where there are these huge geographic distances. But that also means they know what industries are there, right? They know if they are in a place where factories have switched over to advanced manufacturing and students need to be trained in a robotics degree. They know if their communities are really facing a shortage of respiratory therapists and are creating an associate's degree program for folks to get into those jobs. We really see that they're able to match the needs of their local community, particularly those in natural resources economies that may be changing over time. How can we make sure that we're filling where those big labor market needs are? Rural community colleges play such a central role in workforce training for trades and for workforce development in health and teaching, and all of these really important career paths that keep our small towns and rural communities healthy. And it's really incredible to see the work that they're able to do without students needing to go off to college, without needing to move to the big city to get a degree. Rural community colleges are providing that locally. Now, there's a lot of challenges still for students. Those distances that Mara talked about are enormous sometimes. A lot of times folks are working, attending part-time, have more family commitments. It is not that traditional, they're 18, move away to college life, but it is getting students the kind of workforce training that they need to enter a career path that's going to support their economic mobility.
So what that makes me think is that we might need to redefine what success in higher education looks like for rural students, because it is very place-based. It's driven by the local community and the needs of those students.
Absolutely. And what students are looking to achieve, right? Especially today, think about rural communities. All of us know that have labor shortages in teaching or in health careers, and also might have a booming remote economy or a booming wind power economy or any number of new careers that none of us really thought that much about when we were in college. Community colleges are the ones who are really stepping in to train students to do those modern jobs.
Good point.
So I also think it's important. Oh, sorry, just to add, I think it's also, I think this idea of student choice is really important in making sure that students actually have options to be able to make choices. So, I mean, I think that the work that rural community colleges do is absolutely essential. It's completely undervalued, and it's playing this really critical role right now. I also want to make sure that we don't think about the rural students that want to go on to get a 4-year degree and just don't have access. So I think it's really about expanding those options. And like you said, maybe really rethinking how we define success so that students actually get to define it for themselves. Students and families get to define it for themselves, and then actually have that, complete array of options open to them.
Good point.
I was going to say the same thing, Mara. I'll put on my practitioner hat, Melissa, and I can't tell you how many students I've worked with over my career when I asked them, so what would you like to do? Where would you like, what's next for you after high school? And they would say, nobody's asked me that before. And that broke my heart because the assumption was you won't go to college, you'll stay here. Or to Mara's point, maybe they didn't really necessarily want to go to community college. I think people assume that rural students don't also crave a college experience where they could go to a campus or have, build a community in a new way. And I think opening more doors for students rather than closing them or making assumptions about what students do actually want to do is very, very important, that we turn that conversation over to a new leaf, right? And really are thinking about an expansive view, particularly in areas that don't get as much attention. For example, so many of my former students wanted to go into the arts, and what a beautiful opportunity for them to bring that back to their community and increase arts and culture and those types of aspects of rural communities that I feel like, we make a lot of assumptions that rural students just want to go into agriculture. They want to go into their age-old traditional industries that are in their hometowns, and many students do, and that's wonderful for them. But there's so many students who also want to use their own unique skills and strengths to improve their communities.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So you have indicated that we don't know a whole lot. There's gaps in their research as it relates to rural students, and it is surprising that that gap is there. Why do you think that rural higher ed has been so under-researched?
I mean, I think there's probably a variety of reasons. I mean, I think partly it's that assumption that we talked about, that rural communities don't value education. So why study rural higher education if it is almost a contradiction in terms, right? And so, I mean, I think that bias is maybe kind of threaded throughout a lot of, funding decisions and, I mean, and then in general, rural communities and schools, we know they're kind of underrepresented in the literature at large. So I think there's that piece too.
Yeah. I think another reason to build off that point, Mara, is population size has really driven where a lot of resources, time, energy, research goes. And while rural America makes up, as we all know, a huge percentage of this country, in fact, most of this country, their population sizes are smaller, which means it's hard. Some folks have found it difficult to include them in larger studies or work with rural communities. And I think that's really unfortunate, right? Because we are stronger by understanding the experiences of rural students, particularly in higher education. And I think that rural communities have actually a lot of ideas about how to strengthen college going and how to think about higher education in their community and take a lot of ownership in that. I think we mentioned again how rural students graduate from high school at a higher rate. I think there's amazing reasons behind that, right? We have smaller schools and sometimes stronger communities that these students are participating in, and what an opportunity that research could have. And we certainly hope to have to illustrate that communities, I think, do want to be a part of this process, but for so long have not been included in the research conversation about what's happening in their communities.
So how does this lack of research impact policy decisions at both the state and the federal levels?
This is a great question and a real challenge for many of our rural schools and rural community colleges. A lot of times we'll see that a policy is passed that implies in it simply hire more math teachers, simply have a smaller guidance counselor caseload, simply offer a new community college trades program. And the reality is, if you're operating a small high school or a small community college, you don't have enough students to be able to simply stand up a new program. You don't have the population to simply hire another qualified math or science teacher. It's very hard to recruit, and it's also very hard to retain specialized staff. It's very hard to find resources to invest in starting a new program or policy. So a lot of times we see that our high schools and our community colleges receive an unfunded mandate, do not receive any resources to implement that new policy or program, and the students are the ones who are really left behind. So if we're able to generate some new knowledge about what works best in rural high schools and in rural colleges, that's really going to support the ability of local folks to advocate for what they need or what will work uniquely best in their context, not something that might work in a city or a suburb with closer distances, more resources, more population, but really something that's going to work in the rural context.
Yeah, I would also add that rural people, as someone who comes from a long line of them, are very innovative and find a way with not a lot. And I think the benefit of having more research and building more evidence in this space is we can direct scarce resources, capacity, and time to things that are working, right? And we use this in other spaces, and we should absolutely be thinking about this in our rural context. And I think it allows us to yet make better investments to help schools and help communities take these resources and use them to the best of what we know at that time. And to Alyssa's point, as a practitioner, that's something I absolutely would experience at national conferences. I would go to a presentation where people would say, oh, this is the tried and true intervention for college access. And my colleagues and I would sit in the back of the room and we're like, there's no way that's going to work in our communities. And we would struggle to find spaces where our thoughts and voices were heard, or even, for example, in research presentations, thinking about how rural communities fit into that. I'm excited to say that those spaces, there's a small and mighty crew of us, and it's growing. And that makes me really happy that there are more spaces and more conversations happening. But I think, for example, at the policy level, that research and evidence can be really important there to help us think about more regional specific policies that include rural areas. I think that's going to be a really important part of how we move forward in particularly rural college access and success. How can we take regional approaches? How can we think about regional policy making, things that make sense for these communities?
And I was just going to echo too, and Sabrina, you sort of hit on this, but like I think it's not just about sort of what are the barriers or how do current policies not work in rural areas, but I think it's also about like what are the really cool, innovative things that people are doing on the ground, and how do we find out more about those, lift up those practices so they can be expanded. And then I think also too, you may talk a lot about rural versus urban, but I think oftentimes we really need to be thinking about those places that are spatially, or the places that are made spatially marginal. And so this might be very rural places. This also might be some very urban environments. And so, are there practices that we can lift up that are really promising coming out of rural communities that might actually apply in other places too, that might have some of the same resource constraints, even if they're not rural? So yes, I think there's a lot of success that we're overlooking when we don't really look at rural communities or rural schools or rural students. And so I'm hopeful that a center like this is also going to be lifting up those practices.
Mhm. Such a good point. We have more in common with urban as it relates to resource access than I think people realize.
Exactly. And I think that kind of lens really helps us think then also about, organizing advocacy, some of the cool work we might be able to do across lines of urban versus rural to really address some of the deeper issues, which is really about access to resources and, spatial inequality.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So Sabrina and Mara, I know both of you are working on a study that is part of this initiative that we've been talking about. So can you give us a little teaser about what you're investigating and what you're hoping to find?
Yeah, I can start us off. So we're really excited to be looking at community-based college access organizations that are serving rural communities specifically. So these kind of community-based organizations are really critical, particularly for under-resourced communities in terms of getting students to and through college. And so, they actually can help offset some of the limited resources that many school districts might face because they have they can be flexible. They've got many of these programs really develop trusting relationships between adults and students. And so this is the kind of stuff that really gets kids to college. The way I often describe it is, you can think of kind of a big canyon where on like one side is high school, on the other side is college. And oftentimes there's not a lot of there's not the bridge getting kids across. But in many places, it's that community-based organization that's the bridge. Yet we know very little about these kind of community-based organizations, especially those that are serving rural places. And so Sabrina and I are going to be looking at these kind of CBOs in Oregon and Idaho specifically, which is also a particular region that's kind of understudied, even in kind of the landscape of rural education as a whole. And we're going to be looking at community-based organizations, those that do this kind of rural serving college access work. And we're going to be identifying the qualities and practices that appear to positively influence college student outcomes. So acceptance, matriculation, persistence in graduation. And the study has two parts. One is a landscaping survey looking at, who are the organizations that are serving rural students in Oregon and Idaho, and what are some of their practices? What are their missions? What do they seem to be doing? And then we'll be going deeper on 4 sites that using case study that seem to have particularly promising practices when it comes to quality outcomes. And looking to see, how do they work? What do they do? How is it that they get students to and through college? And we're going to be specifically choosing a diversity of organizations so that we can kind of think about, maybe places, organizations that serve communities with different kinds of economies, or maybe organizations that serve different populations. So we can really get a better understanding of what are some of these practices that do produce these outcomes, and then to be able to think a little bit about, okay, and how might we replicate this elsewhere?
What's the timeline that you have set up for your work? So when can we start seeing some of those initial findings?
So ours, we're going to be working on this for the next 5 years. And so we'll be beginning with that landscaping study and then moving towards the in-depth case studies. And as both Sabrina and Alyssa indicated, we've got a real interest in getting findings out as quickly as possible, so that people can actually start using the information. So this is not like okay, and we'll see you in 5 years. We will be beginning to produce results and share what we're finding as that becomes available.
So, and I know you're not supposed to bias your research, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. So if you had to make an educated guess, what do you think this study is going to reveal that hasn't been understood before?
That's an excellent question.
A very good question. I can start if you want, Mara.
Yeah.
I mentioned I come from these programs, so I'll acknowledge my own positionality when it comes to this work. But even in that, even in my tenure working in college access programs, I think that what the field yet doesn't know are, as Mara mentioned, the different components that make up these organizations at a somewhat of a larger level. We've seen a lot of either some works that happen at the individual organization level. But I think Tamara's earlier point about highlighting innovation, that we haven't seen such work happen at scale, and really to start to understand what are the commonalities across these programs, what types of interventions they use, how are they getting students to college. It seems so novice, but it's really crucial, I think, to understanding how these folks who are so in tune with their communities, the needs of their communities and their students, how they're designing programs and opportunities to help students get to what's next. I certainly think that seems very of course we'll understand that, but to me that's a huge finding in and of itself. But Mara should add to that.
One thing I'm really curious about is, I think we often frame it, especially to rural students, as though they have a choice and they can either choose home and stay in the rural community, develop, continue their close relationships with family and friends, and they're live out that commitment to their rural place, or they can leave, pursue higher education, and pursue social mobility, but not come back. And given some of my other work on rural college access, I think some of the students that are most quote unquote successful. And I mean this in sort of a variety of ways. Successful in terms of the typical indicators around graduation rates, et cetera, but also successful in terms of those students that feel most fulfilled. They're able to find this kind of third way where they are able to maintain tied and committed to their rural place and also pursue education. And so I'm really interested in the practices that help students navigate that third way, and the adults who do that. And so if I had to guess, what's an indicator of success, or what's one practice that leads to good outcomes, I would imagine it's those adults who are able to really think flexibly about education and commitment to place, and help students do both and have it all.
Love that. I'm excited to learn as you are going along what you're seeing in your findings. So before we wrap up, I want to make sure that our listeners know how they can learn more about the work that you're doing with the center. So where can they go for information, and how can they get involved if they'd like to be?
Sure. We would love to hear from any and all listeners about what they think is interesting. If we got anything wrong today, if we should take our research in new directions or new ideas, we're really eager to hear from the people that this research is really meant to benefit. So you can reach out to any of us directly. We also have hopefully an easier email address for folks to remember, which is ruralhighered@mdrc.org. That comes directly to Sabrina and me, so you will get one of us live and in person in your email inbox, but really eager to continue to disseminate through the places that felt the most useful as well. So you might see us at future conferences. Sabrina and I are both planning to attend the Rural Summit in Alaska in April, if we'll see any folks there. Sabrina has also made guest star appearances at the NREA conference in the past, and I know Mara has as well. So really hoping to continue to engage with folks throughout the 5 years of the project.
That's fantastic. So Mara, Alyssa, and Sabrina, thank you so much for joining me today. This conversation is just the beginning, and I'm looking forward to continuing this series with all of you. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next episode of this series. And as Alyssa said, if you have questions, ideas, experiences that you want to share, make sure that you reach out to them so that they can take that under advisement, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you all for being here. Take care and keep advocating for our rural schools and our students.
Thank you so much for listening to the Rural Scoop. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. And be sure to follow on Twitter at Dr. Sadorf. That's Dr_SADORF, so that you never miss a new release. You can also check out previous episodes of The Scoop wherever you get your podcasts. Production support for the Rural Scoop is provided by Chattanooga Podcast Studios. Find out more at ChattanoogaPodcastStudios.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education.